definitely not. Don't you find the spirit threatening what you did with mine? You squashed it. But guess what? I can hear. It's my spirit still breathing, breathing loud and
Hello, my name is Alison Lyons and I'm Director of Dublin UNESCO City of Literature. Every year we bring you One Dublin, One Book, and this year we are so happy to be featuring Leonard and Hungry Paul by Ronan Hession. I hope you've been enjoying the month of events so far, and please do read this fantastic book if you haven't already. It's available from all good bookshops, and it's also available from your local public library in ebook and e-audio formats through the BorrowBox app, which is free. One Dublin, One Book is brought to you by Dublin City Council with kind support from the Department of Tourism, Culture, Arts, Gaeltacht, Sports and Media. And you can find out more on our website, onedublinonebook.ie. And now I hope you enjoy this evening's event celebrating Leonard and Hungry Paul.
Welcome to this One Dublin, One Book event, in which I have the very great pleasure of speaking to this year's featured author, Ronan Hession, about his selected book, Leonard and Hungry Paul. Leonard and Hungry Paul is a story about two gentle and quiet friends who see the world in their own particular way and who don't care much about fitting in. Through board games, tentative attempts at dating, and family transformations, their story is told in beautifully crafted sentences that are full of humour and tenderness. This is a charming, life-affirming story that will stay with you. Born in Dublin, Ronan Hession began writing Leonard and Hungry Paul in 2017. Already a musician, he has released 3 albums under the name Mumblin' Defro. Ronan's career in writing might be a later development for him, but this book has already found fans here and abroad. It's been published in Britain and in the United States, and it's been nominated for many awards, including the Kerry Group Irish Novel of the Year 2020. Ronan's second novel, Paninko, will be published in May 2021. And so without further ado, I'm delighted to welcome Ronan Hession.
Thanks very much, Nadine. I'm delighted to be here. It's an incredible privilege. You know, I've lived in Dublin all my life. I've been walking around the streets, and I never thought when I wrote such a sort of quiet book that I thought would really go under the radar, that it would be selected for something like this, and that my fellow Dubliners would be reading it across the city. It's amazing.
Yeah. For the uninitiated, can you tell us a little bit about the plot of the novel?
Sure. The novel begins with Leonard, who's a very gentle man in his early 30s who lives quite happily at home with his mother. And as we'll hear in one of the readings later on, she passes away quite unexpectedly, and that starts in place a chain of events where Leonard has to start to reevaluate his life and try to figure out a way of engaging with the world without it overwhelming him. And the key relationship at the centre of the novel for him is his friendship with Hungry Paul, who's a very sort of self-contained, quiet person who has a very idiosyncratic view of the world. And really what the novel does is show them in their setting, with their families, and how they try and figure out, how do you try and live in a world with all this noise and competitiveness without being overwhelmed by it.
It's a book that has struck a chord with so many readers, myself included. I hadn't seen characters quite like that before, and it's such a beautiful, life-affirming read. Can you take us back to where you were when the idea first came to you for Leonard and Hungry Paul? I believe you started writing the book in 2017?
Yeah, that's right. So it was early in the year. I hadn't intended to write a novel. I had been carrying around a sort of sense of Leonard as a character, this quite soft and vaguely melancholy sort of character. And actually the first image I think I had in my head was of him coming in from work and taking his shoes off the lazy way, using the toe of the other foot to take the shoe off. And for some reason that image just stayed with me. And I carried him around for a while until eventually I said, I'm going to write about this guy to get to know him. And quite quickly I said, well, why don't I just do a novel? It's not as if I have to ask anybody. So I started exploring him, and very quickly I got the sort of sense of his world and the way his mind would work. And within a quite short period of time, it took me about 3 months to write the first draft of the novel. I worked every evening after my kids went to bed. And it was almost like I was some sort of Russian doll, and I had all these characters inside me. And as soon as I started twisting myself open, and then I twist open another level, I kept finding all these characters who'd been, germinating inside me all the time.
What was your context like, though, at the time? You mentioned your kids. You have a proper grown-up job. You were working in the Department of Social Protection, I believe, or even actually at the time, I think you were at the Department of Finance. So a very different life.
Yeah, my work life was very busy. My family life was quite busy. And in fact, that's really the reason why I had stepped away. I was previously involved in music, and I'd stepped away from it because all those other responsibilities were taking over. But I guess your creativity doesn't go away. But my life was quite busy, but I had been for several years, I think, carrying around this sort of thought about silence and quiet and how that fits into the world. So when my children went to bed, I'd sit down at 10 p.m. and my imagination not spreading that far, I was surrounded by children's encyclopedias. Leonard is a ghostwriter of children's encyclopedias. I was surrounded by board games, which the two guys play. So I really just, almost by osmosis, just picked up what was around me. And it was strange to sort of sit down and the house is quiet after a noisy day. And perhaps it gave me an appreciation, just as I say that, of the value of silence. Because when you have a day where your brain is full, where your world is busy, and you have this precious couple of hours before bed, that's probably what woke me up to the value of silence and what a stabilizing force it is.
I want to hear a bit more about the novel, but before we do that, can we go back in time to your own childhood and to what you were like as a kid? You went to school in Ballybock in O'Connell's school, and you didn't study the arts at college. So what were you like as a child?
I think as a child, I was pretty high energy, shall we say. My mother would have left me out the front door at probably 7:30, 8 o'clock, and I probably wouldn't come back till 12 hours later and would have played football that whole time. So I wasn't particularly, I wasn't a kid you thought would become the arty one. I wasn't necessarily a bookworm. I would have read Asterix books and comics and that kind of stuff. But as a child, I think I was very sort of sporty. I can see threads back to writing. Like when I was about 7, my mother, when summer holidays, said, well, why don't you write a story? And I wrote a book. I wrote a sort of adventure story. And then when I went back to school, my teacher got me to read it out in the classroom. And other teachers got me to read it then. So you can sort of trace it back there. But I think in my teenage years then, I think I was probably just a bit unsure of myself. I think I wasn't, for men, it's strange. I don't know whether it's the same for women, but for men anyway, if you're not really keen on socializing in a group, it's very hard to sort of find, bilateral friendships. They come later in life. All my best friendships now are sort of twosomes. Whereas back then, even though I played football, which kind of gave me a free pass, I was never bullied or given hassle because I played football. I was so established there. But in my own time, I would have been quite into just going for walks and just quite a self-contained person, I think.
Were you a big reader?
Not particularly. And I think that probably comes from being quite high energy and sitting still. We didn't have that many books. My father, he died when I was 7, but he had been quite a big reader. But we didn't have that many books in the house. My older brother, Michael, is a huge reader in history. And my second eldest brother is a priest and he studied English. So he had lots of books later on. But growing up, no, I was much more into drawing, much more into playing with Star Wars figures, much more into playing football. So I didn't have, anything that you wouldn't have looked at me and said, that guy is going to enjoy sitting still quietly when he's an adult.
Well, one of the things I mentioned was that you didn't study the arts at college. You actually studied economics at Trinity College Dublin. Were you aware, I guess, from a young age, in common with many people who go on to become writers, that the arts is maybe not the most financially rewarding of careers a lot of the time? Yeah,
I did my first ever gig in February 1993 and learned that lesson day one. I think it was a pretty blunt apprenticeship. I think when I was at college there, I was very involved in the music scene, and a lot of people actually I knew from that time have gone on to be in this entertainment, industry, like David Kidd, for example, or David O'Doherty, or Patrick Frayne, Anna Carey, all those people. So, and a lot of people were in bands, and it was I think it was partly because Trinity has a certain reputation now, I think, because Sally Rooney, people sort of view it as being quite a prestigious place. When I went, we had free fees, and it was basically a city centre college. So it's like a sort of campus where you have Dublin City to yourself. So it was a very relaxed place, and they don't work you very hard. In my final year, I had 60 hours in total, so like four hours a week over 15 weeks. So there's lots of time for not being a student. So I really enjoyed that time, and a lot of my friends that I'm still in contact with now, I made there. But subject matter wise, the only reason I did economics and politics. I did politics because I loved Billy Bragg and I wanted to learn more about politics. And I remember when I was trying to make up my mind what to do, the currency crisis was on. This is going back before we had the euro, and I couldn't understand any of it. And I said, I can't do politics without doing economics. I hadn't done it in secondary school. And I never liked economics. I never understood it, and I thought it had become ideologically very single-minded. And I think there's a bit in Leonard and Hungry Paul about that, where Peter, Hungry Paul's father, is an economist, and I managed to, squeeze in a couple of paragraphs about where I think the economics community has gone wrong. Not that they care what I think.
Well, we'll talk a little bit more about your emergence as an artist, because of course you're a musician as well and a writer shortly. But before we do, Emma Kirwan has a reading prepared from the novel. Perhaps you could tell us a little bit about this excerpt.
So yeah, Emma's going to read the opening section of the book, which is, when I'm doing readings myself, it tends to be the piece I do, because it opens with the story of Leonard, it creates Leonard as a character and gets across his very close and, I think healthy mutually appreciation for the type relationship he has with his mother. And it sort of sets up who he is. And I think in a way, he kind of gets the ball rolling from the novel.
Lovely.
Leonard was raised by his mother alone, in cheerfully concealed difficulty. His father having died tragically during childbirth. Though she was not by nature the soldering type, she taught him to look at life as a daisy chain of small events, each of which could be made manageable in its own way. She was a person for whom kindness was a very ordinary thing, who believed that the only acceptable excuse for not having a bird feeder in the back garden was that you had one in the front garden. As sometimes happens with boys who prefer games to sports, Leonard had few friends, but lots of ideas. His mother understood with intuitive good sense that children like Leonard just needed someone to listen to them. They would set off to the shops discussing conger eels and have deep conversations about Saturn's moons on the way back. They would talk about tidal waves at bath time and say goodnight with a quick chat about the man with the longest fingernails in the Guinness Book of Records. But Leonard grew up at a time when quiet, imaginative children did not yet enjoy the presumption of innocence. His mother often found herself having to take his side against honorary teachers who complained that they found it impossible to get through to him. With patient, maternal endurance, she would sit by herself at parent-teacher meetings explaining that, like his late father, he just lacked a eureka face. Even into his 30s, Leonard's mother still liked to fuss over him, buying his favourite ham for lunch, the one with fewer veins running through it, leaving tea by the bedside for when he woke up, and ironing well-meaning creases into his jeans, which Leonard would quietly iron out later. He repaid her thoughtfulness by keeping her company through her later years, and generally including her in the uncrowded bandwidth of his life. Leonard was not exactly sure, but there must have come a point when the relationship grew from a purely filial one into one of partnership. Though an adult son living with his widowed mother is a situation about which society is yet to adopt a formal position, it is clearly seen in second-best terms. Insofar as anyone noticed, they might have assumed that she was overbearing and that he lacked initiative and possibly a sex drive. In reality, neither sought to limit or interfere with the other, both being independent people who liked their own space and who, quite simply, got along. Leonard did recall with some awkwardness around the suggestion that they go on holidays together, though he was not entirely certain which of them had first proposed it. Mother-daughter holidays are normal, of course, and father-son trips are famously storied as a way to come of age. Mother-son holidays, though, have the connotation that one of them must be a burden on the other. But truth be told, they were well suited as travelling companions. She was a keen walker and had good gallery feet, being able to wander around any reasonable exhibition in its entirety without being distracted by the gift shop honeypot that drew in tired women half her age. They both liked churches, and even though Leonard was not the religious himself, much of the world's art is. He would enjoy visiting famous paintings and sculptures in European cathedrals, while his mother would busy herself lighting a candle in the side chapel for her fragile, long-departed husband. She'd never really asked Leonard about girls, knowing the delicacy of the subject for him, and also because of her own doubts about whether his apparently celibate life was due to a lack of interest or opportunity. For Leonard, the fact that he still lived at home with his mother led to a certain self-restraint on practical grounds. He had wondered what would have happened had he brought a girl home, only for them to wake up to 2 cups of tea at the bedside the next morning. His mother passed away unexpectedly one midweek night in her sleep, tucked into a duvet with her clothes all laid out for the next day. her neatness being a sign of her respect for the small things in her life. The doctor noted the cause of death as a heart attack, but emphasised that there were no signs of suffering or drama. He said that her heart must have simply run out of beats. As Leonard was a shy only child of two shy only children, it was a small funeral. The front of the church was practically empty, with the exception of Leonard, as people tended to underestimate their relative closeness to the deceased and sit several rows further back than they should. With no extended family to rely on, Leonard had to multitask at the funeral, reading the prayers of the faithful, bringing up the offertory gifts, and taking care of all the other minor jobs that are usually done by cousins and in-laws. The priest's sermon was a generic one about death and hope, which was a relief for Leonard, as his mother disliked it when people summarised a dead person's life in glib caricature. Had he had the courage, Leonard would have spoken up and said that his mother looked after everyone in her life as though they were her garden birds. That is to say, with unconditional pleasure and generosity.
And thank you so much to Emma Kieran for that reading from Leonard and Hungry Paul. Ronan, we were chatting before the excerpt about your beginnings, if you like, as an artist. You were studying in Trinity College, observing the activities of those around you. You mentioned people like David Kitt, Patrick Freyne, both who went on to become musicians and or writers in Patrick Freyne's case. Tell me a little bit about how you yourself started venturing into that world with your other incarnation, Mumblin' Death Row.
Yeah, I started out when I was in secondary school. I joined a band with a couple of friends from my football team, a band called Rinty. And we were sort of a chaotic sort of band. We would sort of make the fall look organised. We didn't really have our heads around guitar tuners or anything like that. But nevertheless, it was where I sort of started writing songs. And I remember at one stage during the summer, I just wrote a whole batch of songs, about 10 songs. And I remember bringing a tape round to my friend Emmett, who was the singer in the band, and saying, well, do you want to do these in the band? And he was very, very supportive. So I started that, and then, but bands are very hard to keep together, just for various reasons. So I started then playing solo while I was in college under the name of Johnny Horsebox. That was my first incarnation. I think at that stage I was trying to be Billy Bragg, I think. But then later on, I got very much into blues music and acoustic blues music. And so people like Mississippi John Hurt, the Reverend Gary Davis, Blind Lemon Jefferson, and so on, Blind by Fuller. So I suppose in homage to those great blues artists, the guitarist in the band I formed gave me the nickname Mumblin' Death Row. And that remains to this day my email address, my Twitter handle, and causes much puzzlement from people who have to contact me. So I played music for a long time, and in the early 2000s, about 2002, put out my first album called Seeing My Friend, and did 2 more albums in 2007, 2012. The third one was nominated for the Choice Prize and sort of got me a bit better known. But it was a really great time. That whole period, the independent scene around Dublin was really, really rich. And there's so much great music that came out of that period. Largely, the scene I belonged to was really based around the Lower Deck in Portobello, which was a dingy underground pub that used to be a place for sort of strip clubs and stuff in the 70s. It was kind of infamous for that, but they managed to increase its respectability one notch anyway by going to letting indie bands play there. So yeah, and I've always had that sort of connection with my creative side. And as I get older, particularly when I stood back from music in 2012 and before I got back into writing, I realized just how much it's a part of me. And it's really only, to be honest with you, it's only really in the last 3 or 4 years that I've been in any way comfortable calling myself an artist without feeling hugely self-conscious or pretentious about it. I sort of come to understand what it means. And I think it really means it's about the way you look at the world, primarily in terms of resemblances. You see one thing in terms of another. And I just have got more comfortable with that and more self-confident about thinking of myself that way. But for a long time, it was something I would have really played down.
Can you tell me a little bit about the scene at that time? You've mentioned different figures, but as I recall it, there was a point when the International Bar was a big point of focus as well, because you had singer-songwriters like Gemma Hayes, Paddy Casey, various versions of the Frames coming through there. And in a way, it seemed like Ireland was a very safe home for singer-songwriters at that point. I mean, if you look back to that particular era, David Gray's White Ladder would have been released around the tail end of the 90s. And we were kind of the country that gave him a lot of his early success. So did it feel kind of inspiring at that point to be writing songs and being creative in a city that was accommodating to that?
Yeah, absolutely. It was very, I actually worked with Gemma Hayes in the charity shop. And I was at her first ever gig, actually. And Dublin was that sort of place, you know. I sort of felt a little bit outside the singer-songwriter scene because I think I resisted the idea that being solo was a genre. You know, there was almost a sense that if you played solo, you could only play one type of music. And while I really respect those musicians and I love their music, it wasn't how I saw myself. And I think by playing blues, I was able to learn guitar techniques, finger picking techniques, which meant that I was able to do reasonably complex bass lines and melody lines that weren't just strumming, you know, 3 chords and a truth. So the big thing I think that made a difference then was that self-releasing music got over the idea that it was a vanity project, that you were able to set up a record label, record your music. Like I recorded my first album on a Roland VS880, which is about the size of an Xbox, and pressed 500 copies over the Czech Republic myself, got them into the country. And yet the Irish Times reviewed the album. You know, Adele Coffey interviewed me for the Sunday Tribune. In fact, almost every outlet that ever interviewed me subsequently went out of business. But it felt very attainable, you know. And even now, you know, my book came out on a tiny publisher, and they can't believe all the attention I'm getting over in Dublin, or that, you know, we get such support from the wider publishing world. Ireland is just a bit more open that way. I don't know why, but I could go into a shop. I was involved in a music collective at the time, and I would go around the shops getting them stock CDs that really didn't sell that much. But there were always people there who were saying, okay, we'll stock it on a sale or return basis. And that was huge. And at the time, from the time I did my first album, which was, people were, is it a vanity project, is it not, to 2012 when I did the last one. You know, that decade, there were so many great albums that came out as a self-release, and it was a really vibrant scene, you know. And I think it meant that you could do gigs easily, it meant you could stock your CDs easily, and it meant you could get them covered, so it didn't feel like you were just playing to your friends.
Well, in common with most artists of that era, and indeed any era, there always comes a point where people feel that they have to sort of grow up, if you like. And you're in your 40s now, born in 75. Was there a point when you thought, I must put away childish things and devote myself entirely to my job in the civil service?
I'm a real believer. I was in the civil service in 97. So my whole music career was in parallel, and I'm still a civil servant now. And I'm a real believer in integration when it comes to creativity. I don't really subscribe for myself to the idea of compartmentalization, that you do your one thing. You identify as one thing, and therefore you need to make grown-up choices. I always felt that, I allude to this actually in Leonard Murphy Paul, that you more or less get the answer to life's problems in junior infants, which is because they say to you, okay, what you have to do is eat good food, you have to play with your friends, be nice to your family, you have to make music, you have to make the first thing we learn in primary school is creative writing. First thing you do is learn how to write stories, you paint pictures, you go to bed on time, you brush your teeth. And I still live like that, to be honest with you. I haven't found a better formula for living my life. And a lot of the writers I admire, like my favorite writer is a guy called Naguib Mahfouz, the Egyptian writer and the only Arabic Nobel laureate. He was a civil servant all his life, wrote over 30 novels. You know, there are many examples in Ireland of civil servants who have had artistic careers. Thomas Kinsella, for example, also went to O'Connell's and also worked in the Department of Finance. I think it's helpful when you have those people to inspire you. But I've always tried to, I'm the same person when I'm writing music as I am when I'm writing books, as I am as a civil servant, as I am when I'm giving out to my kids.
It's similar to what the Irish author John McGahern, the late John McGahern, once said. You know, it's necessary to be regular and boring in your day-to-day life so you can be creative and exciting in your fiction. And that's a paraphrase, but it is where he was coming from. And he also said that, you know, he farmed at one stage so that he could afford to write fiction, but then he said at a certain point that the cows had basically become pets, and the writing was now supporting the farm, which was a wonderful turn of events. But can you bring me to the point where writing took over from the music?
Yeah, I'd stopped writing music really in 2012. I think part of it was just burnout. And then I'd written an album every 5 years up to that for the previous 15 years. And almost my sort of biological musical clock, my creative clock, kicked in after 5 years. And in 2017, really when I sat down, I never sort of had ambitions to be a writer. I still don't identify as a writer. You know, I feel it's very important, and it's always been that way with me with music, not to mix up your identity with the creativity. Creativity is, I see, much more in terms of you're channeling something. And I try not to appropriate it. I don't think any of the lovely things people have said about Leonard and RuPaul, I don't take that personally. You know, I always try and keep respectful of creativity because I don't really understand it. I have a very stable relationship with it, but I don't really understand it. So really in that period of 2017, when I started writing, I realized that there was a buildup of creative energy. And when I was writing, I felt like I was in a sandpit having fun, and I felt very at home. And it was clear to me that just as I felt at home in music, my creativity had just changed into something else. But it felt very familiar, and I felt very natural. I felt I could hear my instincts very clearly.
Well, before we begin talking about the themes of the novel, why don't we go to a song now from one of your favorite artists, Bridget May Power.
I was holding
And thanks to Bridget May Power. Ronan, we were talking a little about getting to the writing of the novel, which you began in 2017. Can you tell me exactly what it felt like to live with the characters over that period of months? I believe you described somewhere that it felt almost a bit like being pregnant with these characters.
Yeah, very much so. I think one thing I hadn't, obviously when you write your first novel, you don't know what writing a book feels like. And there is a real sort of sense every evening when I knew at 10 o'clock I was going to start writing, or I'd carried a scene around with me for the day. It was like that sort of feeling when you first get into a swimming pool and you just get under and your body adjusts to the temperature and you sort of don't want to come out. So you get very much in the world of these characters, and you do sort of feel like you have a relationship with them and you want to do right by them. You know, I'm always really conscious when I'm writing or when I'm reading that the characters can only do and say what the writer allows them to do and say. So I always try to be fair with them. I always sort of think, you know, if Grace or Peter came up to me afterwards and said, why did you make me say such a dumb thing or do such a dumb thing, that I'd be able to sort of handle that question. So a lot of the writing, you can obviously get the words on the page, but a lot of the writing decisions are around getting that judgment right. And it's almost like a book exists in a certain frequency range, some part of your mind that is just there. And I think when you allow yourself to write from that place, it's sort of preserved in the book, because when people talk about their feeling or how they felt when they read the book, I can tell that that sort of frequency range, that sort of atmosphere is preserved for them. It just comes through. I don't know how it works exactly, but I think it's very important as a writer not to try and drive the thing too much. You're sort of listening to instinct, you're sort of picking up where it should go. And I think maybe it sometimes appears that writers just design a plan and then fill in all the details, but there's a huge amount of it is just your intuition, and you're trying to intuit so much of the book. So when it's over, then you're trying to emerge from it. You'll never see these people again. You know, it's a bit like when you go to a wedding and you're sitting beside this lovely couple and you're from the bride's side, they're from the groom's side, and you're like in the car on the way home, that's terrible, we'll never see those people again. They were lovely people, you know, but they're on the other side of the family. So it sort of feels like that, you know, when it's over.
Did you plot out the book at all?
Not really, no. Not really. I always knew what the next couple of chapters were going to be about. I had an idea of how it would finish, what I was working towards. But I plotted in the same way that you might, you know, plot, you know, a city break. You know, so you go to Rome and you say, yeah, at some stage we're going to see the Colosseum. You know, at some stage I want to have a nice pizza. At some stage I want to go see some opera. But I'm kind of flexible whether we do that today, this afternoon, or before we go home. So I just had a sort of general sense. And I think I always try to, it's a bit like, you know, when you're reading a book and when you finish one book, it suggests another book. I wanted to have that chapter by chapter, you know, that when I finished a chapter, I had a sense of where it was landing and whether I wanted something that was more of the same or a change of mood. So I like to sort of allow that sort of spontaneity, but also just I did a little bit of mapping to say, you know, looking at the characters, because the book's written in vignettes. So you have the characters in different combinations, and that's one way in which you can get to really see a character by putting them in different rooms with different people. So I sort of had a sense, well, I haven't had a Hungry Paul chapter in a little while, or I haven't had a Helen chapter in a little while. So I'd manage that. But beyond that, it's pretty, I suppose when people are improvising or making up as they go along, they say organic. So I'd say pretty organic.
Zadie Smith said that she also writes novels without a massive understanding of exactly what that final page would be. She doesn't do huge character arcs or structures, but what she did say was that often meant that for her she had to spend an incredibly long period on that first section, that first chapter, because from there everything flowed. So did you also have that experience?
Yeah, I certainly, and I think it's a common thing in debuts that you edit the first chapter finally. But one thing I did was in editing, and I did it in my subsequent book as well, is I get to a point where I have different approaches to editing. So one thing I would do is I'll do, first of all, I'll edit the whole book, and then I will edit it by character. So I'll do all Hungry Paul's bits. I'll do all Grace's bits to make sure they're consistent. Then I'll do them in reverse order. Because if you're doing it in reverse order, you're not paying attention to the plot. You can just do the chapter in isolation. Then I'll do all the dialogue bits. Then I'll do a whole edit where I'll read it out loud, which will help with comma placement. Then I'll go back and do the same again. And then I might say, I might just mark up some key conversations and that might only be like a paragraph, but I might carry that around me for 2 weeks. That's kind of it's almost like a songwriter's time. And then and later on in the process, I'll do what I call sort of putting the poetry in. So it's a bit like you have a skull and you decide you're going to go back and put the raisins afterwards. So that's again a songwriter trick where I will say there's a poetic opening here. There's something here. There's an image waiting for me here, and I'll go back, and they will be, you spend 2 weeks and it'll just be one sentence. Like there was one, when you get to editing, and this is all before I even talk to my editor. Right, there was one section where Leonard goes into his mother's room, and this is about a few weeks after she's passed away, and it's his first time going in there, and he noticed that it's already changed, and just trying to get the line that captures that. So what it says in the book is that there was just a generic smell of dust undisturbed, and so that one sentence took a week. And there's a lot in that, because you effectively mentally have to go into that room every day for a week. And you think, are there traces of perfume? No, that's too obvious. Are there, a stale smell? No, there wouldn't be a stale smell there. What would capture that? And just the idea of dust undisturbed was, and the undisturbed is quite a lot of poets use that. They get an unfamiliar version, Hardy has that, uncoffined. So I think when you're doing that editing and those sort of fine points, as Zadie Smith says, you do have to spend a lot of time at individual points. I think it's in some way planning a book is a bit like stretching before exercise. You can get away without doing it, but you pay for it later.
Very true. There's a moment actually towards the end of the novel where a point is made to one character. I won't reveal more, but it said, you don't have to be the superhero. You don't have to be the family superhero. And I think that line is quite important as a theme in a way of the novel overall, because these characters, Leonard and Hungry Paul, they're brilliant characters. I loved reading them. But they're not superheroes. They're gentle, ordinary fellows going about their business in the world. And is there a kind of point that the book is making that you can be this, and this is authentic, and this is worthy of examination alongside the Marvel superheroes or whoever?
Yeah, I think so. I think once I started working on the book and paying attention to the way in which kind people actually change the world and are kind of superheroes. And I remember one news story when I was working on it where they showed this guy, and at the GPO in Dublin is a congregation point for homelessness services. And this guy used to show up there. He was a dental technician. And what he would do is take the imprint of the gums of the people who needed dentures and come back the next week with dentures.
Wow.
So there's somebody who is not saying they have the answer to homelessness. They're not saying they understand the issue. They're not claiming to understand the people. But what they've done is said, well, look, there's one thing I can do. There's one thing I'm good at that most of the people don't know how to do. So what I'll do is I'll take that talent and I'll offer it to people who need it. And likewise, there's another shop in Dublin that it's a sort of a shoe repair shop. And they have a service where if you're sleeping rough and you need to get your sleeping bag zip fixed or repaired, they do it for free. So they don't say, well, look, we don't have the answer to all this. We're not the world leaders. And Leonard and Hungry Paul are like that. Hungry Paul is a man with very limited skills. He's okay with that. He's perfectly normal. There's nothing deficient with him. but he knows what he can and can't do. And one thing he's very good at is something I wasn't good at when I was young, which is sitting quietly. And he understands the sort of value of quiet. And so that simple thing that he finds easy and other people struggle with, he just offers that to other people. And that's the sort of, and the thing about kind people, of course, is that we all know them. You only discover kind people when you need help in your life. And then you realize they're there. Then you realize the importance of it. And they're not competitive people, they're not attention-seeking people, and often they're quite overlooked. And in fiction, I think so, often overlooked. But so I just thought they were worthy of study.
Let's go now to another excerpt from the book, Leonard and Hungry Paul, read by Emma Kirwan. Which excerpt, what are we going to read about this time?
Well, this is a section where Hungry Paul is a casual postman. He just fills in on Monday mornings whenever people are ringing in sick, which is the job I used to do. And this is where he is on his round and it's reflecting on the role of silence and why is it that silence is actually the most difficult thing, or the idea of being alone with your own company is one of the hardest things. In fact, solitary confinement in the prison system is about leaving people alone with nothing but their thoughts. So it really contains, I think, in a capsule, the philosophy behind the book.
Lovely.
Hungry Paul continued on his rounds, his bag getting lighter and lighter, doing a job that had existed, largely unchanged, for hundreds of years. To any busy person burdened with all of life's responsibilities and preoccupations, Hungry Paul's lot would seem a bearable one. He didn't have to decide which of a patient's limbs to amputate first, or where to invest life savings of a company's pensioners. There was no pressure to report fourth quarter losses to the higher ups in HQ or force feed carrots to a fevered toddler. His job, on the few days that he did it, involved no agonising decisions or regrets that might spoil the conversation over dinner. And yet, in modern vernacular, postal work is a profession that has become synonymous with violent meltdowns. Why would this happen in such an apparently placid line of work, which involves chatting happily to the householders and performing a task that has throughout history been shown to be helpful in all ways? Most overworked middle managers would gladly swap their late evening conference calls with the West Coast for the simplicity of the postal worker walking in the mixed March sunshine alone with his thoughts. However, such white-collar fantasies fail to consider what is that bends even the most pacific minds towards self-destruction. Though we may be a species that prizes great minds, we are also terrified of and by our thoughts. In prisons, the most extreme and austere punishment that is meted out to errant prisoners, those whose behaviour exceeds even the diabolical standards of incarcerated society, is solitary confinement. The awful fate of being imprisoned with only one's thoughts for companies, with no distractions. One thought billiards another, and an endless internal monologue drowns out the rest of life, bringing dissonance, the silence, restlessness, the stillness, and anxiety to forethought. A certain type of person, isolated and unsuited to long daily periods of reflection, will eventually think themselves to madness. But Hungry Paul seemed to be able to maintain his peace, where another man might have declared war on themselves and those around him. What did he think about? The answer is, quite simply, nothing. Hungry Paul had been blessed with a mental stillness, which had become his natural state over the years. His mind worked perfectly fine, and he had all the faculties of a healthy, if slightly unorthodox man of his age. He just had no interest in or capacity for mental chatter. He had no internal narrator. When he saw a dog, he just saw a dog. without his mind adding that it should be on a lead or its tongue was hanging out like a rasher. When he heard an ambulance siren, he just heard an ambulance siren without noting its Doppler effect or wondering if it was a real emergency or just a driver running late for dinner. And it is in this way that Hungry Paul maintained a natural clarity throughout his day and stayed apart from the trouble that the world will undoubtedly make for those who look for it. At around midday, he finished his deliveries and dropped his bag back to the depot. There was one last letter to deal with before his day was finished. He took his competition entry out of his breast pocket and posted it in a box outside the sorting office, affixing a patchwork of smaller stamps that he had saved up in the back of his wallet. This was all done without any sense of excitement or concern about the competition. His entry was merely an offering. He didn't so much want to win as help. If some other phrase was selected, then that was fine too. The house was empty when he got home. Peter and Helen had left a note on the fridge saying that they had gone off to buy a Buddha at the garden centre. Hungry Paul made himself a peanut butter sandwich and, having failed to find any treats in the cupboard, ate it alone in the kitchen on the seat where he'd watched the birds only a few hours before, the feeders already empty again. He decided to lie down on the couch and took off his shoes the lazy way, with the toe of one foot prizing off the heel of the other, the laces still done up. His feet tingled now that the weight had been lifted from them after a long morning of walking. He dozed off, not minding that he would later wake with that drugged feeling that comes with a second sleep. All around them, the house stood in a state of empty, quiet equilibrium.
And thanks again to Emma Kirwan. Ronan, we were talking a little bit about the themes of the book. One of the other notable elements of the book, at least from my perspective as a reader, is the idea in a way of how male it is, and the sense that, you know, when one of the characters goes dating, it's a very tentative kind of form of dating. And while I read this book as, you know, coming at it from a female perspective, I often thought to myself, you know, like I was reading it going, is that what men really think? Is that what's really going on in their heads? And I found myself turning to my fiance going, is that what you thought at times? And so when you were writing the book, did you feel like you were offering up a perspective of the shy man? I mean, I know it's difficult to say that one perspective is emblematic of society as a whole, but again, the book feels like it's giving you a portrait maybe that we don't often see of the hesitant gentleman in life.
I suppose so. I wouldn't have thought of, for me personally, but again, I'm coming at it from a male perspective, I wouldn't have necessarily thought that Leonard or Hungry Paul are sort of quintessentially male, in the sense that they are people who, I think they're sincere people. And I think when Leonard has to go and meet Shelley and try and get his head around that, there's a whole piece missing of his world. The way himself and Hungry Paul have got through life is in a sort of self-taught way. You know, they understand the universe based on TV programs they've read or books they've read, their own conversations. They've had to make sense of the world inside a bubble. And for both Leonard going into that date, or indeed Hungry Paul when he tries to bring back Dinner Sweets, when they try to go out into the real world where things are a little more complicated, their inexpertness, I think, comes out. But I also hope there's sincerity. I think Leonard sort of recognizes, I think, that he's a sort of hermit crab who has to go from a small shell into a slightly bigger shell. And in the meantime, he's a little bit vulnerable. And he doesn't quite know how to go about it. But he's trying to do what he imagines the right thing to do is. So I don't know, I suppose, I suppose I can relate to that a bit. I wasn't trying to play it up excessively, but I can relate to bits, you know, the bits about buying clothes and stuff. I'm still like that. Every time I buy a new jumper, I'm on Twitter saying, "What do you think of my new jumper?" Because it's still such a novelty for me. So I think it does capture that. I think what comes through, I hope, in those sections is their sincerity. That what they're trying to do is they're trying to be themselves, although their instincts are telling them to be something else, and they're trying to find out what's the right balance there.
It's a really funny novel. It had me smiling or laughing so many times, but you managed to keep the sincerity of the characters there as well. There's never a sense that the author isn't on the character's side. How did you manage that balance?
I suppose I think partly that's influenced by the fact that I didn't think it would be published. So I was just trying to make myself laugh. I suppose one thing I don't respond to well in books is very cynical writing. I think in general I try to not just to sit back and critique the world and say the world is awful. I think what I try and do in the book is say, and the characters themselves voice that the world is a big bad place. But to try and say, well, that being the case, is it possible to find a path through that? So when it came to the humor, I really just wanted to, I was enjoying writing the book and I was enjoying expressing myself. And, you know, when I was from a family of 8 children, so if you're a family of 8 children, you're constantly told you're not funny. And now that I've got children, they're always telling me I'm not funny. So, you know, there's nothing better than sitting at the laptop and making yourself laugh, which sounds kind of self-indulgent. But I also think it's just a natural thing, you know, in any Irish situation, the first thing people will do is try and make people laugh. But it's a risky thing, you know, putting humor in a book is a really risky thing, because if you put humor in a book and someone doesn't laugh, there's no arguing with that. You know, you can't argue, no, it is a funny book. If they haven't laughed, that's it, you know.
Your editors at Blue Moose, did you have conversations like that where you had to either stand your ground or go back and rewrite?
Well, I have a great relationship with my editor, Lynn Webb. Lynn is my publisher's mother-in-law. She's a woman in her early 70s. She's a former professional wrestler, and she's a brilliant editor. And the way that we work through our sort of comment box epistolary relationship is that we don't, and I have the greatest respect for Lynn, and we don't operate on an egotistical level. So it's never her point against my point. I have great respect for Lynn as a reader. And if Lynn tells me this doesn't make sense, or if she says, sometimes you get this, a comment box that comes back and says, is this meant to be funny, or is this a joke, or is this a serious point? And I say, well, look, if you have to ask that, I better change it. Or sometimes she would use humane phrases like, not up to your usual standard. So we work, and I don't take offense at any of that. Now, there are times where I did have to say, no, I disagree on this, and here's why. And invariably what we would do, there weren't many of those, and sometimes they were just small details. But they were really, we'd park those and come back to them and we'd have a conversation. And Lynn is really there, like a good editor is almost like a coach. You know, they're there to push you, and they're sometimes trying to find out if you really care about that piece. But we are both meticulous. So I don't mind if it's 1 a.m. and we're going back and forth on, you know, should Hungry Paul have a stubby pencil or a full-size pencil? And we both care enough about that. And we went back and forth. One of the only surviving Irishisms in the book is referring to a dog's tongue like a rasher. And we were going back and forth over several days where I had extracts from Bacon magazine in the US saying, no, they don't call it rasher over there. In the UK, they call it a rasher of bacon. So but you care enough about the details that you will. And I know Lynn cares very sincerely, and she's a very perceptive reader. So we've a great relationship. But we do have differences, but we also respect each other enough that we always have a path to work those out.
The book has won so many admirers around the world. It's published here, of course, also in Britain and in the States. And on Twitter and social media, I've started to see so many people, well-known names, tweeting in admiration. And also, of course, actually, when it was first published, the Minister for Finance, Paschal Donohoe, was also very warm in his congratulations to you on the book and very much lauding the book as well. What does it feel like to have big names, well-known people get in touch with you or mention online that they're fans of the book?
It's really lovely, and it's really people have been very sincere, and you know, whether there have been some, you know, well-known writers that I really respect who've been very, very kind about the book, but there are also, one of the nice things about publishing and writing now is that any reader can get in touch, and I get lovely messages from people. So it is, I think it's a very, as a writer, I'm very appreciative of it, but I also have to be careful that I don't have it on my shoulder too much when I sit down to write. You do, to some extent, have to sort of detach yourself from the book and let people make it their own. But I'm extremely grateful. I think most of all that people read it, you know, and if people don't like it or like it, I completely respect that. I think that it's a big commitment to read a book. It's 8 or 10 hours out of your life. So if people take the time to come back and tell me about it, and when you have some, you know, some of the like Kit de Waal or Donna Ryan, Diane Setterfield, people like that, big international names, like Kit de Waal, for example, she just got it through the post. No, nothing about me, nothing about the book. She just read it when the postman brought it, and she said like she was still there an hour later reading it, and she just took it upon herself to champion it. And so many people have done that. You know, I have had a sort of, you know, an underdog dividend, you know, where people have sort of, because our marketing budget is zero, you know, so people have taken it upon themselves, and contrary to what people say about the publishing world or the book world, they are still packed with sincere book lovers who will really do their best, if they feel strongly about a book, do their best to help it find readers. And I've been a real beneficiary of that, and I'm very, very appreciative of it.
You have a new book on the way?
Yeah, that's right, Panenka. Here's what I baked earlier. So that's going to be out on the 20th of May. So that's a different type of book, really. Panenka is about a man, a 50-year-old man. Who's lived much of his adult life recovering from the mistakes when he was younger, in particular his relationships and other choices he's made. And just as he starts to get reconciled with his estranged daughter and his life is starting to come together, he starts to lose it again. And he suffers from a quite serious health condition. And what the book really looks to explore is, how do you find a path through life when your life is unfixable? You know, so often when things go wrong in our lives, we try to make it better, we try to repair our relationships. What if that's not an option? And how do you find a path of some peace through that? So it's looking at regret, it's looking at, I think, in a way, loyalty. But the themes that are in Leonard and Hungry Paul, I felt it was a very different book to write, very different emotional register. It's a sadder book, I think. But it's been brilliant. The people who love Leonard and Hungry Paul have responded really well to it. And it's interesting because the same themes, I'm not as aware of it as much as the writer, but the same themes are in family, relationships. That's still at its core. I get quite moved even thinking about it. I think it's a book that really, I put my whole heart into it. It was a very involved book to write, but I'm looking forward to seeing what people think of it.
I'm very much looking forward to reading it. Ronan Hession, thank you so much for speaking to us. And my thanks also, by the way, to Emma Kieran and to Bridget May Power. And now to close, let's finish off with a song from Bridget. Thank you.